After the corporate party, when my wife finally came home, my head was still pounding with the scene of a man leaving her at the door. His knowing smile, his lingering touch on your arm before pulling away. Something there was wrong. And discomfort ran through me, a pang in the pit of my stomach that refused to be ignored. I watched her go in, calmly, as if nothing had happened, and the man got back into the car as if there was no burden on his conscience. But there was one detail he didn't expect. I was there, in the shadows, watching. The way he adjusted the rearview mirror, his eyes checking something inside the car before leaving, this wasn't a simple ride. My heart raced in a way it shouldn't have. I followed the car without thinking twice. My hands were gripping the steering wheel, my breathing was heavy and ragged. With each turn he made, the deeper I felt the pain growing inside me, the uncertainty becoming suffocating. Who was he? Why was I leaving my wife at home at that time of night? The answer was drawn before me as he parked in front of a discreet building, without much adornment, but immersed in an atmosphere of secrets. I waited for minutes that felt like hours, trying to muster the courage to confront him, to understand what the hell was going on. And then he left. Cell phone in hand, laughing at something he was reading. But what really destroyed me was when, before entering the building, he turned around, and I saw it. The sparkle in his eyes, the satisfaction on the face of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. And then my world fell apart. It wasn't just any man. He wasn't just any stranger, someone my wife had just met. That face was familiar to me. Too familiar. I felt the ground disappear beneath me. Blood running cold. Every beat of my heart resonated like thunder inside my chest. Because he wasn't just any lover. He was a man who had already been part of my life. A man who had somehow known my wife for much longer than I realized. And it was no coincidence. I didn't sleep that night. I walked home like a ghost, walking down the hall as if I were in an alternate world, where my own life was an enigma I had never deciphered. My wife slept soundly, her body serene under the sheets, as if nothing was out of place. As if there was no guilt, as if that betrayal was just a daydream of mine. But I knew. My chest burned with a certainty that stuck like a blade. I had been betrayed. In the days that followed, I spent putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Little details that once seemed insignificant now screamed in my mind. The way she laughed on the phone, the rush to hang up when I entered the room. The days when she came home with a different sparkle in her eyes, but never giving much explanation. I never suspected because I trusted her. Because it was easier to believe that it was all paranoia than to admit that the woman I loved was capable of deceiving me. But I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes. And when I finally saw it, when the truth was brutally revealed to me, I felt something die inside my chest. The shock, the disgust, the suffocating anger, all mixed into a whirlwind that consumed me completely. They were together. And it wasn't just desire, it wasn't a one-night stand. It was something constructed, cultivated, hidden under my nose. And the worst? The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. The worst was the lie. The worst part was the fact that he knew exactly who I was. He knew. He always knew. At that moment, I understood that nothing I had done, no promise, no effort, no love, would have been enough. Because the truth was crueler than I could have imagined. She hadn't just betrayed me. She had deceived me. And her lover. Her lover carried a secret I could never have predicted. A secret that would transform my pain into something much darker. Something that would make me ask for a divorce without hesitation. Something that would make me realize that that betrayal wasn't just about desire, but about something much bigger. And that's when it all made sense. Every detail, every furtive glance, every well-told lie. The reason he was there that night, dropping her off like a thoughtful gentleman, as if he wasn't a home-wrecking scoundrel. The reason he smiled when he read those messages on his phone. The reason my wife never hesitated, never seemed uncomfortable. Because she already knew him before I did. And because, deep down, I was never the only one. What I discovered that night changed everything. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that there are betrayals that go far beyond a simple affair. Some betrayals are premeditated. Some betrayals are built on years of patience and calculation. And what I discovered that night, was that, from the beginning, I was just a pawn in a much bigger game. Welcome to the channel where the truth about cheating is revealed without filters. Here, we do not romanticize or justify infidelity, on the contrary, we show how betrayal corrodes, destroys and leaves irreversible marks. The stories you will hear are fictional, but the pain, consequences and lessons are real. Because whoever plays with other people's trust, sooner or later, pays the price. Get ready. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reality check. Ever since they met, Daniel and Emily were the kind of couple that inspired admiration in others. He, a meticulous, successful and always rational man, had a firm and assured presence that made everyone around him trust him. He was not the type to get excited, nor did he allow himself to be carried away by impulses. Emily, on the other hand, was a vibrant woman, full of life, who radiated charisma and friendliness wherever she went. His way of speaking and gesturing engaged people, making any conversation interesting. Together, they seemed to balance each other out almost perfectly, and it was exactly this dynamic that made their relationship seem solid, unbreakable, something built on foundations of respect, affection, and, above all, trust. The marriage of almost 8 years was stable, at least from the outside. They had a well-decorated, comfortable home, the result of years of shared effort. Every detail of that home had the essence of both of them, from the meticulously chosen furniture to the paintings spread across the walls that brought memories of trips and special moments. The couple's room was a refuge of complicity, where every night they lay side by side, talking about the day, about dreams for the future, about the small banalities of their routine that, somehow, still made sense when shared between them. Emily always had a sensitive eye for detail, and Daniel appreciated the way she made the home a welcoming space. He liked the predictability of life with her. He liked knowing that at the end of the day he would return to a place where he felt loved. Their routine was like that of any successful couple who shared the challenges of modern life. Daniel worked at a large company in the financial sector, his schedule was busy, but he always found time for Emily. I liked to surprise her with small gestures, a special dinner on a random day, an unexpected gift, or even a simple note left next to her cup of coffee in the morning. Emily, in turn, worked with corporate events, which meant she was surrounded by people all the time. He loved the movement, the exchange of energy, the creativity involved in each project he led. She was the type of woman who left marks wherever she went, always remembered for her friendliness and good taste. However, despite all the apparent stability, there was something in the air that Daniel couldn't explain. Small changes that were imperceptible at first began to become constant. The glow in Emily's eyes seemed to fluctuate, sometimes intense, sometimes distant. There were moments when she seemed more absorbed, as if she were lost in thoughts that she no longer shared with him. He tried to ignore the feeling, to convince himself that it was just the natural wear and tear of time, of routine. But something bothered him. Small unexpected delays, vague answers, a new habit of checking your cell phone more often than before. He didn't want to be the kind of husband who obsessed over these details, then pushed them to the back of his mind, rationalizing everything. It was then that the company party took place. It was an annual event, an important celebration where everyone showed up, dressed to impress. Emily spent days preparing for that night, choosing the perfect dress, making sure every detail was flawless. Daniel followed everything with a mix of admiration and discomfort. He liked to see her excited, but something worried him. That night, she was stunning, radiating a kind of energy he hadn't seen in a while. He accompanied her with pride, he stayed by her side for most of the event, exchanging looks, smiles and conversations. But at a certain point in the night, he lost sight of her. He wasn't the jealous type, never had been. But there was something about this sudden disappearance that made him uneasy. He walked around the room, greeted colleagues, pretended to be completely absorbed in the conversation, but, deep down, his mind just wanted to find her. That was when, from afar, he saw a detail that made him shudder. Emily laughed. But it wasn't just any laughter. It was a loose laugh, accompanied by an intense, deep look, directed at a man who was next to her. A man Daniel had seen before. A familiar face, but one that, at that moment, seemed completely out of place. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, so he waited. Observed. He tried to find a context that made sense. When Emily finally returned, minutes later, she looked the same as ever. He touched his arm affectionately, smiled and said he was enjoying the night. But something there was already different for him. The party ended late, and Emily said she would stay a little longer, helping with the last details of the event. Daniel didn't see a problem. He said goodbye, went home and, in an effort to trust, tried not to entertain assumptions. Until, hours later, he heard the sound of a car stopping in front of the house. He got up automatically, as if something was pulling him towards the window. His heart accelerated the moment he saw it. It wasn't a taxi, it wasn't just any colleague. It was that same man. He opened the door for Emily, who came out smiling, straightening her dress, saying goodbye casually. Something inside Daniel shattered in that instant. But he didn't say anything. He just watched, feeling his heart heavy, his emotions mixing between shock, disbelief and an uncomfortable chill down his spine. When Emily entered the house, she greeted him normally, as if nothing was out of place. She said she was exhausted, that the event was a success. He kissed him lightly and went straight to the bedroom. Daniel remained there, still, feeling every cell in his body react in a way he had never felt before. The man in the car remained there for a few moments before finally starting the car. Daniel couldn't hold back. He took the car keys and left, following the vehicle through the city. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, I didn't know what I expected to find. But something inside him said he needed to find out. That he needed to face this before his mind was consumed by doubts. With each street they crossed, with each stoplight that closed, their breathing became heavier. Uncertainty was worse than any truth. Until the car finally stopped, and Daniel realized that the fate of that night held more than he could bear. The car followed the streets lit by yellow streetlights, cutting through the silent night with the smoothness of someone who already knew the way. Daniel kept a safe distance, his eyes fixed on the back of the vehicle, feeling an increasingly tight knot forming in his chest. His heart was pounding, his breathing was irregular, and a mixture of anger and disbelief took over every muscle in his body. He didn't want to believe that this was happening, that the woman who shared his life, his home, his future, could be getting involved with another man. But the way she said goodbye, the way she fixed her hair when she got out of the car, the way she smiled in a different way, something was wrong. And he needed to know how far that lie went. The car made a final turn and entered a discreet parking lot attached to a small apartment building. Daniel parked at a distance, turned off the headlights and watched. He saw the man get out of the car and walk a few steps forward, before turning back and waiting. Emily exited the vehicle a few seconds later, adjusting her dress again. The man smiled at her, a smile that carried something of intimacy, of comfort, of possession. And then it happened. The light touch on her waist, the fingers sliding through the fabric, and the way Emily accepted that contact without hesitation, without retreat. Daniel felt his throat close, his stomach felt as if he had been punched. But he didn't take his eyes off the scene. The two walked to the entrance of the building, the conversation flowing lightly, naturally, as if it were routine. As if they had already done this before. And then, right there, under the dim lighting of the entrance, he pulled her close and kissed her. No rush, no fear. A kiss that wasn't one of discovery, but one of familiarity. A kiss that, for Daniel, was like a blade cutting into his skin, opening a wound that could never be closed. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Every detail of that moment stuck in his mind like a hot iron. The way his hands cupped Emily's face, how she leaned her body closer, how her fingers slid through his hair before slowly separating, exchanging looks filled with something Daniel didn't want to decipher. But the message was clear. They were no strangers to each other. And that wasn't a mistake. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, searching for some strength within himself to not get out of the car, to not do something he might regret. He felt a furious heat rise to the back of his neck, a suffocating tightness in his chest. He wanted to scream. I wanted to ask her since when. I wanted to understand how it started, how she was able to deceive him so blatantly. But he stood there, paralyzed, watching as Emily and that man entered the building together, disappearing from his sight, leaving behind only one cruel certainty: he had been betrayed. The silence inside the car was deafening. The clock on the dashboard ticked down to minutes that seemed to drag on like an eternity. Daniel felt his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, his entire body reacting to the crushing weight of that revelation. Emily was no longer the woman he thought he knew. Everything he believed about their relationship, about the trust they had built, about the loyalty they swore to each other, everything had been destroyed that night. Every kiss, every touch, every laugh shared over the past few months now felt like a farce. And the worst part was that he had no idea how long it had been going on. How did he not notice before? How could you be so blind? The air inside the car felt heavy, unbreathable. His mind spun, went back, tried to look for signs, moments when he might have noticed something. Small delays. Evasive answers. The phone she started taking everywhere. The sudden increase in good mood, followed by moments of distraction. It was all there, between the lines, but he never wanted to see it. He never wanted to imagine that Emily, his Emily, would be capable of betraying him. The anger was mixing with the pain in a chaotic way, making any rational thought impossible. He couldn't just go home and pretend nothing had happened. I couldn't lie next to her that night knowing that minutes before she had been in the arms of another man. The mere thought was nauseating. He needed to face her. He needed to look into her eyes and see if she would have the courage to lie again. He needed to know the truth, even if that truth destroyed him even more. He waited. He didn't know how long he stood there, still, but his breathing began to calm down, and his anger gave way to a kind of calculated coldness. When he finally saw Emily leaving the building, straightening her clothes as if nothing had happened, he felt a new kind of disgust wash through him. The man stood in the doorway, watching her walk away, as if hoping she would change her mind and come back. But Emily just smiled, a small smile, before heading towards the car. Daniel followed her home. His chest was a battlefield, chaotic thoughts fighting for a space of logic. He knew he needed to confront her, but he wanted her to tell the truth. I wanted to see her stumble over her own words, see how far she would take that lie. So when Emily walked in, she found a different Daniel. He was there, sitting on the sofa, without the lost look of someone who was just waiting for his wife to return. His gaze was steady, sharp, analyzing her every move. Emily smiled, as she always did, and went over to him, leaning in to kiss him. But this time, he dodged. She frowned, confused. He asked if something was wrong, if he was okay. Daniel remained silent for a moment, the weight of the truth suffocating everything around him. And then, finally, he asked her where she had been. Emily blinked a few times, hesitating for a moment, but then gave a rehearsed response, saying that she spent more time helping with the post-event organization. Daniel just nodded, but his gaze didn't waver. Emily looked away, walked to the kitchen, got a glass of water, but he noticed that her hands were shaking a little. She felt something was wrong. He stood up, approached slowly, and then asked again, this time with cutting firmness, "Where were you?" This time, Emily took a little longer to respond. Her mouth opened, closed, and then she laughed, a brief, nervous laugh. "I already told you." "What happened?" Daniel felt his entire body stiffen. The lie flowing so easily from his mouth was another blow, another stab in an already torn chest. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second, and then blurted out the words like a sharp blade, with no room for doubt, no chance of return. "I saw you." And in that instant, all color drained from Emily's face. The silence between Daniel and Emily was suffocating, an invisible weight that settled in the room, making the air denser, almost unbreathable. She didn't blink, she didn't move a muscle, her eyes fixed on him, as if she hoped those words were just an illusion, an unfounded suspicion that he would soon forget. But Daniel's gaze was sharp, accurate, and she knew it. He knew. Every piece of the charade she had tried to maintain fell apart in that instant, and there was no more room to escape. Emily's body stiffened, her breathing became irregular, and Daniel noticed the panic rising within her, even though she tried to hide it. But he didn't just want her to admit it. He wanted to understand. He needed her to say it with her own mouth, to let the truth slip like an inevitable confession, like a sentence. The seconds dragged by, and then, finally, Emily released the breath she seemed to be holding for minutes, looking away, pressing her fingers against the edge of the kitchen counter. He tried a hesitant smile, a last desperate attempt to manipulate the situation, but his voice came out shaky, failing to sound natural. She said she didn't know what he was talking about, that she was tired and that maybe he was interpreting things wrong. But Daniel laughed. A bitter laugh, full of frustration, as if he couldn't believe her audacity in trying to support him with lies even after everything. He walked to the table, slowly pulled out the chair and sat down, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he crossed his arms and repeated, in a lower, colder, more lethal tone of voice, "I saw you." Emily pursed her lips, her hands shaking as she picked up the glass of water she had filled minutes before. He raised it to his lips, but he couldn't even drink it, because the dry anxiety in his throat was greater than any thirst. Daniel watched her every movement with surgical precision, analyzing the way her eyes moved from side to side, how her expression oscillated between fear and indignation. Until, finally, she dropped the glass with a dry clatter on the counter and crossed her arms, trying to assume a defensive, irritated posture. He asked what exactly he thought he had seen, daring him to say, as if there was still any room for dispute. But Daniel was already far beyond that. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and then described everything. The moment the car dropped her off at home, the moment he decided to follow the vehicle, the way he observed every detail, every gesture, every smile shared between her and the man who was now her lover. He spoke of the touch on her waist, the kiss he saw happen right before his eyes, the way they both disappeared together inside that building. Emily remained still, but her face lost color with each word, her eyes shining with a mixture of shock and shame, as if she finally realized the weight of what she had done. But Daniel didn't stop. He asked how long it had been going on, how long she had been deceiving him, how she managed to look at him every day and lie without hesitation. She wanted to know what that man meant to her. And that's when he noticed something. A different hesitation. Emily didn't respond immediately, she didn't try to deny it, she didn't blame it on tiredness or routine like those who cheat and get caught do. She simply stood there, silent, her eyes locked on his, as if she didn't know how to begin. It was then that Daniel realized. There was something more. Something much bigger than just a betrayal. Emily looked away and walked into the living room, sitting on the couch, her elbows resting on her knees, her hands pressing to her forehead. He stood there, breathing deeply, trying to compose himself. Daniel didn't move. Just waited. I knew she was about to say something that would change everything. And when she finally raised her face, her eyes red, an expression of tiredness mixed with a hint of despair, Daniel felt a shiver run up his spine before he even heard her. Then, she blurted out the truth. She said she had known that man for much longer than Daniel realized. That he wasn't a chance, he wasn't a mistake, he wasn't just someone who crossed her path and suddenly enchanted her. He was always there. It was always part of her story. And more than that, it was part of Daniel's story. Emily closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and then whispered something that made every part of Daniel's body freeze. "He's always known you." The words entered his mind like a violent wave, a flood of possibilities and connections that began to form frantically. He stood up, feeling his heart beating wildly in his chest, trying to understand what that meant. He demanded that she explain. And then, with teary eyes, her voice choked with guilt, Emily said. The man she cheated on him with wasn't just a stranger. He wasn't just an occasional lover. He was someone who was always in the shadow of Daniel's life. Someone who had watched him for years, who knew every step, every detail about him. And not because he was a friend. Not because he was an acquaintance. But because he had a reason. A reason Daniel could never have predicted. Emily cheated on him with a man who had a personal reason for doing so. A man who, from the beginning, came into her life with a purpose. A man who always wanted to destroy Daniel, not just by stealing his wife, but by destroying every piece of what he believed to be true. And the worst of all, Emily knew. She's known for a long time. But he chose to ignore it. He chose to believe that the past didn't matter, that what was happening between them was not premeditated. But now that everything was coming to light, now that Daniel was looking at her with pure horror and disbelief, she had no way to hide it anymore. Daniel stepped back, feeling a chill down his spine that nothing could warm. Every memory, every little detail of the past that had previously seemed insignificant now made sense. The presence of the man in his life, the chance encounters, the conversations that seemed trivial but that he now realized were always loaded with hidden intentions. It was as if a veil had been ripped from his eyes, revealing a truth that had always been there, but that he never had the chance to see. And then, with her voice low, almost a whisper, Emily released the last piece of the puzzle, the piece that broke Daniel for good. He always wanted to get revenge on you. And at that moment, Daniel's world collapsed once and for all. Daniel felt the impact of Emily's words like a blow to the chest, a suffocating pressure that spread to every corner of his body. Revenge. That man not only stole his wife, not only destroyed the marriage he believed to be solid, but he did it with a purpose, with an intention that went beyond carnal betrayal. He wasn't just a fluke in Emily's life. He didn't appear spontaneously, he didn't seduce her out of mere desire. He wanted this. He planned. He waited for the right moment to strip away everything Daniel had, and now, looking at the woman who claimed to love him and who, at the same time, gave herself to the one who hated him, he realized that his entire life had been a carefully constructed lie. Emily looked away, unable to look at him. She knew there was no justification that could erase what she had done, but something inside her still tried to find a way to make him understand. But how to explain the inexplicable? How do you tell a man that she cheated, lied, deceived, and yet expected him to understand? But Daniel didn't want justifications. He wanted truths. And if Emily didn't say everything, if she didn't put every piece of this story in place, he would get the truth out of her with every question, with every sharp look he threw in her direction. He approached, his voice deep, tense, firm. He asked who he really was, why that man wanted to destroy him, where this hatred came from. Emily swallowed. His hands shook as he tried to find the right words, but there was no easy way to say it. So, it started from the beginning. He said that man was always close, he always knew about Daniel, he always followed his life from a distance. That the first time she saw him was long before she got involved with him, that it all started much earlier than Daniel could imagine. He wasn't just a stranger turned lover. He was someone who carried an old grudge, a deep-rooted resentment, that had waited years to take shape. He was the brother of someone Daniel destroyed without even realizing it. The air was knocked from Daniel's lungs. His body went rigid, his mind spun trying to find the missing piece. Brother? From who? His past wasn't clean, he knew that. He was never a perfect man, he never lived without making mistakes. But I couldn't fit that information in. Emily watched him with trembling eyes, knowing that the final revelation would be the worst part. And then, she told him. Years ago, before he even met Emily, Daniel was responsible for exposing a dirty scheme within the company where he worked. A scheme of financial fraud, corruption, embezzlement. He didn't think twice before reporting it. After all, it was the right thing to do. He knew the consequences would be severe for those involved, but he never cared. It was their problem. And one of those men who lost everything with the exposure of the scheme, who were publicly humiliated, who had their lives destroyed, killed himself. This man, whose name he barely remembered, left behind a brother. A brother he never forgot. A brother who never forgave. A brother who spent years waiting for the right moment to return the pain with the same intensity. Daniel felt the weight of the revelation crush him. His mind traveled back to that time, trying to pull from memory the face of the man he ruined, trying to remember the details of something that, at the time, he treated as just a side effect of his decision. At that moment, it wasn't personal. It was just justice. But now, everything became personal. His every action led to that exact moment. He destroyed someone without thinking twice, and now someone has decided to destroy him in the same way. Emily continued to speak, her voice increasingly desperate, saying that it wasn't on purpose, that she didn't know anything at the beginning, that when she realized she was already too involved. But Daniel didn't listen anymore. His mind closed, his eyes were empty. Betrayal was already an unbearable pain in itself, but knowing that it was all part of a bigger plan, a reckoning that he didn't even know existed, made everything seem even more unbearable. He looked at Emily, and for the first time, he didn't see the woman he loved. He only saw someone who destroyed him. He took a step back, as if he needed distance to process, but his mind was already moving. I needed to get out of there. I needed to breathe. I needed to find that man, look into his eyes and understand if all of this really was a well-planned game, if every detail, every touch, every word spoken to Emily was part of a carefully elaborated revenge. But before he could move, Emily ran to him, held his arm, trying to make him listen, trying to say that none of this cancels out what they lived, that it wasn't all a lie, that there was love. But Daniel pulled away from her, his gaze filled with something Emily had never seen before. Contempt. He took the car keys and left without saying anything else. Emily stood there, feeling her heart beating wildly, her eyes full of tears, not knowing if she had lost Daniel forever. But she knew that no matter what, he wouldn't let it end like this. He would go after it. He would find that man. And what would happen after that, she didn't know if she wanted to find out. Daniel drove aimlessly, headlights cutting through the darkness as his mind raced with each piece of the puzzle that now fell into brutal place. The world around him seemed like a blur, a collection of disjointed images that passed him by without meaning. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles were white, and his breathing was irregular, heavy, oscillating between contained anger and the desperate need to understand what to do with all of this. His entire life had been a castle built on a false foundation. Emily, the woman he believed he knew better than anyone, had become an accomplice in a revenge that not even he was aware of. He thought his betrayal was enough of a blow to destroy him, but the truth went much further. It wasn't just about infidelity. It wasn't just desire, worn-out routine or a passing mistake. It was premeditated, a calculated move that had been unfolding for much longer than he could have imagined. Emily's every word echoed in his mind, as if they were being repeated in an endless cycle, mocking him. Her lover, that man who stole his trust, who took everything he believed was untouchable, was not a stranger. He was there the whole time, waiting for the right moment to return the pain he carried. Daniel tried to recall the face of the man who, years ago, had been the center of his complaint at the company. He vaguely remembered the dejected figure, the eyes filled with shame, the look on the face of a man who knew that everything was over. But at the time, he didn't think twice. He did what he believed to be right. Justice was served, and he moved on with his life. He never imagined that, on the other side of that story, there was someone who would never forget what happened. A brother who carried this revenge in his chest, feeding a silent hatred, planning every move until everything led to this exact moment. Until Daniel felt firsthand what it meant to lose everything. Anger boiled inside him, mixed with the feeling of impotence, with the indignation of knowing that he had been blind for so long. But at the same time, a part of him tried to fight it, tried not to completely give in to the urge to fight back. Because, deep down, a question was gnawing at him: was he really the victim in this story? He looked at himself in the mirror of his soul and saw a destroyed man, yes, but he also saw someone who, in the past, had the coldness to denounce and destroy a life without ever thinking twice. Was he the good guy in this story? Or just someone who was finally paying the price for the mistakes he made? The truth is, he didn't know anymore. Emily's betrayal stung like a hot iron, but now, behind it, there was something even worse, the feeling that, somehow, he deserved it. That the universe just rebalanced the scales. But whether he deserved it or not, he couldn't just accept it. I couldn't allow that man to continue with his plan as if he had won. The issue now was no longer just Emily, the failed marriage, or the humiliation of being deceived. Now, it was about something much bigger. He needed to look this man in the eyes. I needed to confront him. He needed to know if it was all really worth it, if the revenge he planned for so long brought him what he wanted. And, above all, Daniel needed to see if, in front of him, that man would still have the courage to sustain his hatred. The car turned around the next corner, and Daniel stopped in front of the building where it all happened. He knew he was there. I knew it wasn't over. He left the engine running for a few seconds, breathing deeply, trying to contain the turmoil inside him. But there was no longer any control. He got out of the car, walked to the entrance of the building and pressed the intercom hard. The wait was short. The voice on the other end sounded calm, almost carefree, as if it already knew who it was. And then the door opened. The man was standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes fixed on Daniel, as if he had been waiting for him for a long time. There was no surprise on his face, not even a trace of guilt. There was just something that Daniel couldn't immediately identify. Something between triumph and melancholy. He walked up the steps slowly, his footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway until they were face to face, just inches apart. Neither of them spoke for a few seconds. They just stared at each other, two men trapped in a story that began long before that night. Daniel was the first to break the silence. His voice was deep, loaded with everything that was trapped in his chest. He asked if everything was planned from the beginning. If every moment, every word spoken to Emily, every touch, was part of a calculated plan. The man smiled slightly, tilting his head to the side, as if analyzing the question before answering. So, without hesitation, he said yes. Who waited years for this opportunity? That when he found out that Emily was his wife, he saw his chance to fight back. That it was never just about desire or passion, but about something much deeper. He wanted to see Daniel broken. I wanted him to feel firsthand what it was like to lose everything. But then, something unexpected happened. The man laughed. A short, almost humorless laugh, and then he let out a heavy sigh. He confessed that, despite everything, something went wrong in his plan. Because revenge never went as expected. Because, in the end, he realized that it didn't bring the satisfaction he imagined. He looked at Daniel, and for the first time since it all started, his eyes showed something different. Not hate, not anger. Just tiredness. He said he spent years engineering that move, nurturing the idea that by destroying Daniel, by taking what was his, he would finally feel vindicated. But now that everything was before him, now that Daniel was there, broken, hurt, he realized that the pain was still there. That nothing has changed. That the brother he lost wouldn't come back. That the humiliation his family suffered was still a scar that would never disappear. And that maybe, just maybe, he spent too much time focused on destroying another life, without realizing that he was destroying himself in the process. Daniel heard everything without interrupting. His anger began to fade, giving way to something he hadn't expected, understanding. He saw in that man someone as broken as himself. Someone who spent years living in the past, carrying a weight that should never have been theirs. And, for the first time, Daniel wondered if any of them would win this story. The two stood there, in silence, just absorbing the reality of it all. No blows were exchanged. No threats were made. Just two lives colliding in a moment where everything should have been resolved in violence, but which, ironically, dissolved into something much more complex. Because in the end, what was left? Emily's betrayal had already destroyed any chance of redemption. That man's revenge had already fulfilled its purpose, but without bringing what he expected. Now, there was only a void left. An immense void that none of them knew how to fill. And then, without saying anything else, Daniel turned and walked away. He left that building, that man, that story, because he realized that nothing there could change what had already been done. The past could not be rewritten. But the future was still a blank page. And he, more than anyone, needed to figure out how to write the next chapter. Daniel drove aimlessly, the city passing around him like a tangle of meaningless lights. The weight of the encounter was still in his chest, but not as a knot of anger. It was a void. A deep exhaustion. For the first time, he realized that there are not always winners in a story of betrayal, revenge and pain. It didn't matter what that man had done, it didn't matter what Emily had hidden, it didn't matter what he himself had lost. Everything was already broken. There was no repair. He could scream, he could fight, he could confront, but the result would always be the same. And now? What came next? What happened when the fire of anger went out and all that was left was suffocating silence? His instinct took him to the house where he lived with Emily, where he built a life, where he believed he would have a future. He parked on the street, observing the familiar facade, the lights still on, a sign that Emily was inside. He felt an impulse to go in, to face that woman once again, to demand answers that, deep down, he already knew wouldn't change anything. But he stood there, just watching. Trying to see what's left of that house you once called home. What was left of him inside that place? The answer was clear, nothing. Everything had fallen apart the night before, perhaps long before that. He just didn't want to admit it. Emily should have been waiting for him. She must have been anguished, restless, mentally going over every word spoken, every mistake made, trying to prepare herself for one last confrontation. But Daniel didn't want any more confrontations. I didn't want to prolong that vicious cycle of unanswered questions, of feelings that couldn't be rescued. He knew that if he entered that house, he would not come out any better than he was. What could you say to her that hadn't already been said? What could you hear that would change your mind? The love he once felt for Emily was there, somewhere, buried beneath the rubble of pain. But loving was not enough to forgive. The door to the house opened, and Emily appeared at the entrance. Her eyes swept the street, looking for him, her body tense, as if she expected to see him at any moment. But she didn't notice his car parked a little further away, didn't see the shadow of his gaze watching her from afar. She hesitated for a moment, her arms crossing herself as if trying to protect herself from a cold that wasn't there. And then, slowly, he went back inside, closing the door behind him. Daniel let out a heavy sigh. That was it. The end. He started the car and drove away, feeling the weight of the night piling up on his shoulders. He didn't come home. I could no longer call that place home. Instead, he drove aimlessly until he stopped in front of some hotel. I needed a place to think, to breathe, to understand what life would be like from then on. She checked in, went up to her room and, when she closed the door behind her, she felt her tiredness finally win. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands clasped, elbows resting on her knees. His mind was still restless, spinning, revisiting every detail of last night, but his body was exhausted. He fell back onto the mattress, staring at the ceiling for minutes that felt like hours, before his eyes finally gave in to the weight of exhaustion. The day dawned gray, as if the sky itself reflected the chaos within it. He took a shower, got dressed and left the hotel without a defined destination. He walked along streets he didn't know, among unfamiliar faces, feeling a strange freedom that came with solitude. For the first time in years, he didn't have to go home. There was no need to give any explanations. I didn't need to play a role. And that terrified him as much as it relieved him. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. Several missed calls. Emily didn't answer. She sent messages, asking to talk, begging for a chance to explain. He deleted them all, without reading to the end. There was nothing more to be said. He wanted to move on, but where? The life he built, which he believed to be immutable, fell apart in the blink of an eye. Now, it was just him, his memories and an uncertain future. But then, something unexpected happened. As he walked past a random cafe, he felt a gaze on him. A woman, sitting alone at a nearby table, held a cup of tea in her hands, watching him curiously. It was not an invasive or indiscreet look, but rather a look that recognized pain. Daniel looked away, but for some reason he felt a strange need to look again. And when he did, he realized that she was still there, still watching, but this time with a small smile. Not a smile of pity. Not a smile of ulterior motives. Just a gentle smile, as if she somehow understood what he was going through. He hesitated for a moment, then approached the table, without even knowing why. She looked up at him as she stopped beside him, and he realized he didn't need to say anything. She just pointed to the chair in front of her, inviting him to sit down. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he thought. He pulled out the chair and sat down. And in that moment, for the first time in days, he felt like maybe there was something beyond the pain. Something beyond anger. Something beyond betrayal. A new beginning. Daniel never thought silence could be so comfortable. After everything that had happened, after having his life shattered in a way he could never have imagined, he finally felt something close to peace. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't complete relief, but it was a start. The coffee in front of him slowly cooled as he watched the street move by, people passing by, living their lives without even imagining the storm he had gone through. The weight was still there, of course, but now it felt bearable. It was like a scar that still throbbed, but it no longer stopped him from moving forward. The woman sitting across from him, the one he had met so unexpectedly, was also silent, but her presence was strangely comforting. They didn't need words, they didn't need explanations. Just being there, sharing that moment, was enough. Emily, on the other hand, lived in a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. Since Daniel disappeared from home, his life has become a sequence of empty days, sleepless nights and phone calls that are never answered. She tried everything. Texts, calls, even showing up at his work, but he completely avoided her. Daniel's silence was more painful than any argument, than any scream or accusation. He didn't want any more answers. I didn't want to hear any more of their justifications. He simply erased her from his life, as if she had never existed. And it destroyed her inside. His mind revisited every moment of the last few months, trying to understand where exactly everything started to fall apart. She tried to convince herself that it hadn't been a conscious choice, that she never wanted to hurt him, that she never planned to be part of revenge. But deep down, I knew the truth. He had a chance to stop. He had a chance to walk away. But he didn't. And now, he was paying the price. The lover, the one who spent years planning his revenge, also did not have the ending he expected. When he looked in the mirror, he saw a defeated man. Not because Daniel won, but because, in the end, he realized that there was never victory. Destroying Daniel didn't bring his brother back, it didn't erase the humiliation, it didn't heal the wounds of the past. On the contrary, it just dug an even bigger hole inside him. The obsession consumed him for years, and now that he had finally gotten what he wanted, he found himself empty. Worse than before. Revenge was not sweet. It was not satisfactory. It was a poison he drank thinking it would kill his enemy, but in the end it only destroyed him even more. He tried to move on, tried to forget, but he couldn't. He was abandoned by Emily, who now wanted answers from Daniel, and realized that he spent so much time focused on destroying another man's life that he forgot to build his own. He was left with nothing. Time passed, and Daniel began to rebuild his life little by little. He had new routines, new people around him, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to think about the future without looking back. It was not an easy process. Some nights were still unbearable, some memories still hurt, but he was learning. The woman at the cafe, the one who looked at him kindly when he needed it most, became part of this process. She didn't try to fill him, she didn't try to be a replacement for Emily. She was just there, walking beside him, and that was enough. Emily finally got what she deserved. Life was not kind to her after the betrayal. Her reputation at work was tarnished when the story broke, and she was forced to resign. The social circle she valued so much began to fall apart, and she found herself more alone than ever. She tried to find refuge with her lover, but he wanted nothing more to do with her. For him, she was just a means to achieve his goal, and now that it was all over, he had no reason to keep her around anymore. She lost everything. She lost Daniel, she lost the man she got involved with, she lost her stability, she lost the confidence she had in herself. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her own choices, and this time, there was no one to hold her back. Destiny made a point of making it clear that everyone reaps exactly what they sow. Daniel, although hurt, found a new chance to move forward. Emily, who chose to betray and lie, ended up alone, with the bitter taste of regret. And the one who dedicated his life to revenge realized, too late, that he had spent years destroying himself while trying to destroy another man. And now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment your opinion and share your thoughts. Do you think Daniel made the best decision? Betrayal always exacts a high price, and here on the channel, we make it clear that we do not support any type of infidelity. If you liked this story and want more like it, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications and stay up to date with new content. Remember, trust, once broken, is never the same again.